to thank our supporters, the Tiemens Foundation, Wells Fargo Private Bank, Richard Petrid's Foundation, and also a thank you to our institutional members, El Tomar Foundation, Colorado College, University of Colorado, Colorado Springs, Pikes Peak Community College, Colorado Springs Chamber and EDC, SIVA Charter High School, and Fountain Valley School. With that, I will turn the platform over to member Sky Forrester to introduce our wonderful speaker.
It is still morning, by the way. I checked, it's 11:59. Great to be here. It's great to see all of you, and it's great to be back for an in-person program. I think this is the first one since you started COVID, right? Second, okay. It's great also to welcome Trita Parsi back to the stage. It was 4 years ago, 2017, when Trita first came to this council. He's an award-winning author and the 2010 recipient of the Grawemeyer Award for Ideas Improving World Order. Trita is an expert on U.S.-Iranian relations, Iranian foreign policy, the geopolitics of the Middle East. He has authored 3 books on U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East with a particular focus on Iran and Israel. I should add that Trita was also our guest in our new World Affairs Council podcast that Ray Raymond and I started this summer. His knowledge of Iran and, frankly, his balanced perspectives on U.S.-Iranian relations led us to do a 2-part podcast, which you can access through the World Affairs Council website. The website gives a much longer bio on Trita, but in brief. He was born in Iran. His family moved to Sweden when he was 4. His father had the dubious honor of having been jailed both by the Shah and by the Ayatollah. Now that was balance. He moved to the U.S. as an adult, got his Ph.D. at Johns Hopkins University, working under the supervision of a couple of names you might be familiar with, Francis Fukuyama and Zbigniew Brzezinski. He is the co-founder of the National Iranian American Council and is now executive vice president of the Quincy Institute, and I left out a ton of stuff from his background. His latest book, his third, which had just been published when he was with us in 2017, is Losing an Enemy, Obama, Iran, and the Triumph of Diplomacy, which gives an inside story of the Iran nuclear deal. With the new administration, and as of this summer, a new Iranian administration, I can think of no one better to give us insights into the future of this important relationship between the United States and Iran. And without further ado, great pleasure to welcome back.
Thank you so much. It's a great pleasure being here. I cannot begin to tell you how happy I am to see you all in person. I absolutely hate Zoom by now. I'm pretty sure most of you do as well. So when I got the invitation to come here in person, I accepted it in a split second. Unfortunately, what we're going to talk about is not as pleasant, though. We're talking about U.S.-Iran relations, but I want to start off by putting it into a larger geopolitical context that goes directly to what has been happening in the region in the last couple of weeks. I'm sure everyone has been seeing and following the developments in Afghanistan. President Biden decided to pull out, continuing, adhering, and honoring an agreement that President Trump had signed with the Taliban 2 years earlier. He did so because there were profound strategic reasons for the United States to end that war and extract itself from the mess in Afghanistan. And because at the end of the day, this was also something that clearly had the support of the American public, by and large. In fact, even after the images of Afghans falling off of airplanes, horrible images, as well as the horrific terrorist attacks at the airport, the latest polls show that 73% of the American public nevertheless supported the withdrawal precisely because of a recognition that this war really could not be turned around in any way, shape, or form. And if we stayed another 20 years, we would still have the same impact. Now, Biden mentioned something just a couple of days ago in his speech that I think was quite important. He mentioned that this was just the beginning. It's not a one-off. This is a broader shift away from wars aimed at changing regimes in other countries and turning those countries into images of us, and for a broader end to the endless wars that the United States has gotten itself into. This is critical for numerous reasons, because of the way that it has weakened the United States, because of the massive amount of money that has been spent on it and wasted. We're talking about $8.4 trillion since 2001. $2 trillion of those dollars is just the expense of helping all of the veterans for the next 30 years, all the veterans that have been involved in that war, in these global war on terror wars. Now, the reason why the developments in Iran and the nuclear deal with Iran is so essential, all of this, is because without some form of an agreement with the Iranians over their nuclear program, the broader objective of being able to significantly reduce American military presence in the Middle East, bring the troops home, simply cannot take place. The one issue in the region that still carries the risk of bringing the United States into a land war in the Middle East is the Iranian nuclear program. Without that resolve, all of the other plans of reducing the footprint, shifting focus eastwards towards China, cannot take place. 3 presidents have tried, all have failed. None have gone as far as Biden has in terms of actually ending one war, but it cannot be completed unless there is an agreement on the nuclear issue. So where are we now on that issue, and where are we mindful of the elections that just took place in Iran? No talks have been held since June of this year because of the Iranian elections. So now we have a new government in Iran that is much more hardline, have been very critical of the previous government's handling of the JCPOA, and seems inclined to run a much harder bargain than the previous government in Iran, which can be enough to collapse what little is left of the diplomacy taking place right now. Now, I may sound a little bit irritated in this presentation that you will hear, and it's because I and many others cautioned and warned the Biden administration early on that if they didn't move fast when he took office, we would end up in this current situation in which the nuclear talks are entangled with the Iranian elections and their political season, and as a result, the risk of losing the agreement altogether would significantly increase. Unfortunately, Biden did not heed that advice and instead ended up slow-walking this in the beginning for at least 3 months, and then afterwards, now when for the last 3 months he's been very serious, nevertheless what we predicted, which is that this would get entangled with the Iranian elections, have happened. Let me take one step back and just explain what happened before Biden came in. The agreement was signed, but then when Trump came in, he decided that he wanted to undo it. It took him about a year before he did so. And as was predicted by many, rather than this causing the Iranians to capitulate and beg Trump for new negotiations and come to the table crawling, asking for mercy, the exact opposite happened. As the United States reimposed sanctions on the Iranians restarted their nuclear program, and many of the measures that have been imposed on Iran by the nuclear agreement, they set aside. So for instance, before the nuclear agreement, the Iranians had roughly 8,000 kilos of low-enriched uranium. You need about 1,500 to build a bomb. As a result of the nuclear agreement, 98% of Iran's low-enriched uranium stockpile was shipped out. And they, under no circumstance, could keep more than 300 kilos of MEU on their own. So actually 400, but they never even went above 300. which meant that they never had the material in the country in order to be able to build a bomb. As a result of Trump leaving the agreement altogether, the Iranians started to reduce their obligations, and now they have several thousand kilos of MEU, and they have even gone higher up, 60% enriched uranium, something that they never had before. Moreover, whatever problems the United States had with Iran in the region, they all got much worse as a result of the pullout. So the exact opposite of what he thought he would get is what was begotten. When Biden came in, there was then this big hope that because he had promised during the campaign, as had all Democratic presidential candidates, that they would revive the agreement, return to the agreement, that this would happen fast, precisely to avoid the Iranian presidential elections. Biden chose not to do so, however. He was, I think, fearful that he would come across as desperate if he moved too fast, and instead took his time. This was not meant to be a signal to the Iranians that he was not sincere about negotiations, but that is exactly how they read it. They read it as Biden wanting to make sure that Trump's sanctions on Iran, which had been devastating, would continue for a couple more months to further weaken the Iranians before Biden came back into the negotiations. The response of the Iranians to that was, well, if Biden too is going to use sanctions as a leverage, as Trump had tried to do, well, the Iranians are going to build their own leverage by re-upping their nuclear activities. And then once again, we're back in that cycle, which only made things worse for both sides, and took years of negotiations to get out of it. But this time around, the Iranians went even further. They got 60% enriched uranium. They kicked out some of the inspectors, so the IAEA has not had full insight into what is going on in the Iranian nuclear program since February of this year. This is highly problematic because it's precisely those inspections that gave us the most confidence that the Iranians were not building a bomb. Knowing that we had cameras inside of their program, we could see everything they were doing, we had other types of measurements. Now those cameras have not been taken down. Instead, the Iranians have taken control over them and they're not handing over the tapes to the IAEA as a countermeasure for all of the sanctions that were imposed by Trump and that Biden have not lifted. So we're actually in a situation in which there's greater loss of confidence between the two sides than before. Nevertheless, by mid-March or late March, negotiations started. But there were major stumbling blocks in those negotiations. First of all, the Iranians refused to talk to the United States directly. They did so because, in their view, if they talked to the U.S. while the U.S. was still outside of the negotiation, outside of the deal, the U.S. would use those direct negotiations to put pressure on the Iranians to give more concessions for the United States to go back to the old agreements. And by that, the U.S. would essentially be able to get more out of Iran without giving anything more in return. The end result of that, however, is that the negotiations ended up being extremely slow. The Europeans had to be the go-betweens between the Iranians and the American negotiators. And instead of talking directly, you can imagine how much this slowed down the process. But also, it also made it next to impossible to come to an agreement because neither the Iranians nor the American negotiators would reveal their bottom lines to a mediator. You usually don't do that in a negotiation. You wait for that until you actually see the other side face to face. And we never got to that point. Moreover, from the Iranian perspective, there was a major problem. Trump had not only reimposed all of the old sanctions that had been lifted by the Iran nuclear deal, he had then imposed a whole set of new sanctions, and then he had built what the Trump administration called a sanctions wall. If, for instance, a certain activity in Iran was sanctioned under nuclear pretenses, Trump would then impose those same sanctions on that economic activity, but now under a human rights standing, as well as terrorism. Meaning that if subsequent American administration tried to lift the nuclear sanctions, it would be meaningless, because those sanctions would still remain based on terrorism, human rights, or any other type of a foundation. This was done deliberately to make sure that a future administration would not be able to go back into the agreement. This was actually explicitly stated by the previous administration, and they called it a sanctions wall. So now, for the US to go back in, the Biden administration would be forced to not just lift nuclear sanctions, but also lift sanctions that were imposed on Iran on the basis of human rights violations or on the basis of terrorism. This, of course, was a rather tricky thing for the US to do. On the other hand, the US side had very reasonable, legitimate concerns about what the Iranians had been doing. During the period in which they had reduced their obligations, they had engaged in new research, they had gained new knowledge. So they were not where they were supposed to be if they had simply stayed within the JCPOA. Now they had all kinds of new knowledge, etc., that had to be addressed one way or another, instead of thinking we can just go back to the old agreement. Nevertheless, most of these issues managed to be resolved up until the Iranians hit their political season. I have to say, personally, I was surprised that the negotiations even continued in the month of April, because that's when the Iranian political season was in high gear, and the negotiations continued almost a week or 2 weeks before the actual elections. However, it could not survive the election itself. But something happened in the elections that I think is very important for us to understand, as we are quite keen on imposing sanctions on countries, oftentimes under the belief that sanctions is an alternative to war, even though more and more research show that that is actually quite not the case. In the Iranian case, we have some, I think, quite compelling evidence of how the last 6 months, with the sanctions as well as the measure of Biden to not move so fast on this, actually begot the worst outcome from our standpoint in the Iranian elections. First of all, let me clarify. We call it elections, but we have to be quite clear. These are not free or fair elections. There's a body in the Iranian system called the Guardian Council that vets candidates, and as of late, they don't even need to publicly clarify why they're not allowing certain people to run. So you have situations in which former presidents could no longer run. You had sitting parliamentarians who were suddenly told you're no longer eligible to run without any clear justification for these decisions. In this specific election, however, the Guardian Council went much further than they had ever done before. They allowed 6 or 7 candidates, of which 2 were non-conservatives. But they also made sure that those 2 were so unknown, they had no household name recognition in the country, so that they would essentially be just simple names. Everything to make sure that the election would be designed to go in the direction of Ebrahim Raisi, who now currently is the president. As a result of this, but not entirely because of this, you had a record low participation in the elections. Officially, it was at 48.78%, but if you count all of the invalid votes, people who voted for Batman or who just voted for blank, you ended up having no more than 42% of the population participating in the elections. Compare that to what it was just a couple of years ago, in 2017, during those, or 2013, during those elections. 72% of the population participated in the presidential elections. It dropped 30 percentage points. Now, just looking at how the Guardian Council cheated in this is not sufficient to explain why so few people ended up participating. Because in 2013, they actually tried to do the same thing as well. Rouhani, back then, was not a particularly known person. They had allowed him to run thinking that he would be someone that is so unknown, has no name recognition outside of the national security establishment, that he wouldn't be able to get votes to his side. And to a certain extent, the statistics looked as if they were right, because just a week before elections, polls showed that Rouhani polled at only 8.1%. Within a week, he went from 8.1 to 50.71 on election day. That is a massive increase. The reason why you had that massive increase is because you had several credible individuals in the system who went on a massive campaign urging people, actually very much designing it on American get out the vote techniques, getting people to go out and vote and telling them Rouhani is the anti-establishment candidate, essentially. He's the one you should vote for. And because they had that credibility, people who otherwise seemed to look at the ballot box and seeing no candidate that they were in favor of, all ended up going in favor of Rouhani, and he went from 8% to 50.7%. So what changed in 2021? Why could the same thing not have been done just a couple of months ago? Well, I would point to two things. First of all, the impact of Trump's sanctions on Iran were absolutely devastating. The Iranian economy shrunk 12% between 2018 and 2019. We're not talking about the growth rates dipping below 2%. We're talking about a contraction of the economy of 12%. That meant that the number of poor Iranians increased from 22 million to 32 million. 10 million more people went into poverty. The Iranian middle class shrunk from 45% of the population to 30% of the population. And the Iranian middle class is the backbone of the reformist and the centrist movement who wants to have better relations with the West and who believe that through these negotiations, through a nuclear deal, they could finally be able to rejoin the international community and have better relations, not just with the United States, but with Europe and other countries as well. Now, what this did is that it stigmatized the very idea that Iran's political and economic problems could be resolved through negotiations and an agreement with the United States. This point was then hammered home again when Biden came in and instead of moving fast to be able to rejoin the deal, lift the sanctions, he slow-walked it. And part of the reason this is particularly important is when COVID hit, Iran and Italy and China were three of the countries hit earliest. The Trump administration decided to significantly increase sanctions on Iran once they saw that COVID had hit it, because they saw COVID as something that would be able to amplify the impact of sanctions. So the Iranians have an extremely high death rate because they simply couldn't even buy masks and simple medication to treat their COVID patients. Biden had significantly criticized that during his campaign, saying this is inhumane, this is not the American way. You know, when we have natural disasters, even in enemy countries, we show humanity. But then he comes in, and he had the opportunity of making a couple of very quick changes and fixing that, and he chose not to. For instance, every country had a right to apply for a $5 billion loan from the IMF, only for COVID aid. Trump had blocked it. Biden had criticized it. It was very easy for Biden to just allow that money go. It would only be used for COVID. He did it, and he still hasn't. All of that came in to just destroy the idea that talks with the West, talks with the United States in diplomacy, is the exit for Iran's many economic and political problems. This is then utilized by the hardliners, who for 3 years had been not hammering Trump for the sanctions, but hammering Rouhani and saying, this is all your fault. Of course the United States would betray the agreement. That's the argument of the hardliners. But it's your fault because you did not have a plan B. You put all of your eggs in the American basket, and when the United States inevitably betrayed the agreement, you had your hands down, and now people are dying, the economy is suffering because of that mistake. The hardliner argument is that the hardliners will come in, they will negotiate, they're not against the negotiations, but they will have plan Bs, they will have plan Cs. They will continue activities in the region. They will put pressure on the US and Syria and Yemen and elsewhere in order to make sure that they're not stuck in a situation in which the only option is to make a deal with the United States. Now, this is not an argument that in any significant numbers caused people who supported Rouhani and the idea of engagement to shift over to Rouhani. What it did, however, was to convince them not to vote again and instead stay home. Take a look at the numbers. In 2017, Raisi, the current president, unsuccessfully challenged Rouhani in the elections. He got 15.7 million votes. That same Raisi got about 17 to 18 million votes just a couple of months ago. So he only increased his voting numbers with roughly 2 million votes. Rouhani got 25 million votes 4 years ago. The centrist reformist candidate this time around, however, only got 2.4 million votes. 21 million voters who most likely would have gone in that direction decided to stay home because they no longer believed or had confidence in that this idea of negotiations and engagement would work. They stayed home, and now we have a hardliner in Iran, and the Biden administration needs to figure out, okay, how do we make it work with this new government that is so critical, tends to be much more suspicious and paranoid about the United States, and certainly feels that that paranoia has been vindicated by the events of the last couple of years. So where are we now in the negotiations themselves? There's two key stumbling blocks that is making it very difficult to be able to come to an agreement. On the one hand, and it's all about guarantees. On the one hand, the Iranians are asking of the US side that they want a guarantee that the United States will not once more re-exit the agreement. They want to have some form of guarantee that the United States actually, if it comes back into the deal, sticks to the deal. The answer of the Biden administration has been, we cannot offer a guarantee. The argument that has been used, which I personally don't think is a particularly strong one, is to say because we're a democracy, we cannot tie the hands of future administrations. The reason I think this is a weak argument is twofold. Preamble 3 in the JCPOA explicitly says Iran commits to never ever building nuclear weapons. There is no time commitment to that request. It's not saying the Rouhani government doesn't commits to not building nuclear weapons. It says that Iran will never do so. And arguing that because we're a democracy, we cannot make such commitments, essentially is to say democracies cannot be trusted. That is not the argument we should be making. We should be making an argument that actually makes democracies look more transparent, more reliable, rather than less reliable. There's also a guarantee requested by the American side. The American side, in my view, quite correctly, believes that some of the timelines within the agreement now has to be renegotiated, but it has to be renegotiated after the US is back in the deal. So they want a guarantee from the Iranians that if the US comes back in, Iran will agree to renegotiate some elements of the deal. So for instance, 2023, a year and a half from now, the United States, according to the schedule of the deal, is obligated to lift sanctions in Congress in return for the Iranians ratifying the additional protocol, which means that the inspections in Iran will be completely permanent because it's part of national law. That's a great thing. The only problem is the US Congress never lifts sanctions. When Obama did this deal with the Cubans, he only lifted executive orders. He did not try to lift the embargo because US Congress almost never lifts sanctions, doesn't have a track record. For the administration to pull that off a year before presidential elections is quite a task and will require a tremendous amount of political capital. And it would ultimately be to the benefit of the Iranians if that timeline is changed somewhat, because if the US fails in doing so in 2023, well then all of these negotiations are coming back into the deal and they all be for nothing anyways. The Iranians are very suspicious of this request. And they're suspicious because they believe it's just a maneuver to constantly lengthen the deal and never allow the deal to expire. Because here's the concept behind the deal. Iran had engaged in nuclear activities that were illegal. For it to be able to have a peaceful nuclear program that the international community would feel confident is only for peaceful purposes, Iran needed to go through a prohibition period, being in the box for 15 to 20 years to prove to the international community that its program is for fully peaceful purposes. It's a punishment, but it's not a permanent punishment. There could be no permanent punishment because the Iranians would never agree to that and we would end up in a war. But it's a pretty long one, 15 to 20 years. The Iranians fear that the US request is only meant to ensure that that 15 to 20 years, another 10 years is added on to it because the US side has said that we're looking for a longer and stronger deal. And eventually, what was not supposed to be permanent ends up becoming permanent. So they have flat out refused to offer any guarantees that they're willing to renegotiate those elements of the deal. These are two major problems that they're facing right now. And it's not looking particularly good. But I do want to say something to offer a bit of a sliver of hope. Because something's got to give. And the reason why it's got to give is because both sides absolutely need this agreement. Raisi is not going to be able to revive the Iranian economy unless he manages to get these sanctions lifted. It doesn't matter that the Iranians now have a China option in a manner that they didn't have 5, 6, 7 years ago. Even if they do, it will not in any way, shape, or form be a replacement for Iran being able to trade fully with Europe and other countries, even if trade between the US and Iran itself does not come. So the Iranians need this, and they know it. But also, the US needs this. Because if we do not manage to get this agreement, it's not just about the risk of a military confrontation with Iran. It's the whole rest of the geostrategic chessboard that will be paralyzed, because we will continue to be stuck in the Middle East for another decade or two at a time when it is absolutely essential for the United States to focus on the regions in the world that are actually strategically imperative for this century, and make sure that we are not stuck in the regions of the world that are increasingly becoming strategically marginal to US national interests. So for those two reasons, rationally, this should happen. But then again, rationality is not the trait of humankind. Thank you so much.
We'll take questions. Is this working? If anybody has questions?
Some friends and I were discussing last night the risk of nuclear war, and one of the things that came up is Iran can make a lot of trouble, but does their leadership understand that if they go nuclear, that they're going to be wiped out? Or are they so religiously using their Muslim religion to say it's a better life if we're wiped out? So that, I'd like you to attend to that.
Sure. Thank you so much for that question. No, I don't think that dimension is actually present in these calculations at all. This is not an irrational government that makes decisions based on ideology. Ideology is there, but its decisions are very carefully calculated. That's why, despite all of the sanctions and everything else and the hardship that they have suffered through, it is still one of the strongest countries in the region, and as you mentioned, can create a lot of problems. If this was an irrational, suicidal government, why have they survived 40 years? It defies logic. It's actually, in some ways, worse. They're actually very cunning, extremely Machiavellian, and have played a bad hand very, very well. Doesn't mean that they are not committing mistakes. They're committing tons of mistakes. They don't have the same margins that the United States does. The United States, in my view, has committed a tremendous amount of mistakes in the last 20, 25 years in the Middle East. But the United States is, or at least was, the most powerful country in the world and could afford a very large number of mistakes. I'm not so sure we can going forward. That's again why it's so imperative to extract ourselves from the Middle East. But to your question, what I think their calculation is right now is not that they would necessarily build a bomb to use it. In fact, there's only one country that has used it. Most countries that build it are not building it to use it. They're using it for negotiations, for deterrence, many other factors. I think the game in the region actually is changing. Right now, the Iranian missile capability has leapfrogged and are extremely capable. Obviously not a match for the United States, but we are seeing that because of missiles and the accuracy and the distance that they can fly, the type of overwhelming supremacy the United States or some US allies in the region enjoyed before are starting to wither away. When Trump killed Qasem Soleimani, the Iranians retaliated within 48 hours. They did so by striking the Al-Assad base in Iraq, giving the US side, I think the US side only knew about it for about a half hour or so. The Iranians called the Iraqi government and gave them a heads up of 30 minutes. I think that's when the US found out about it as well. It's of absolute luck that no Americans got killed. It was not because the Iranians deliberately tried to avoid casualties in order to make sure that they responded, but there wasn't any further escalation. They were ready for a full war because of the attack on Soleimani. But because of pure luck, that didn't happen. But what we learned from it is that their missiles are extremely accurate right now. When ISIS hit Iran, they hit the Iranian parliament. The Iranians retaliated, and they hit an ISIS stronghold in Syria. They hit it with 6 missiles. 4 of those missiles hit the exact room where the ISIS folks were having meetings. They missed Baghdadi with 1 hour. 2 of the missiles hit right outside. That is extreme accuracy. And incidentally, it tells you also something. All of the conversation about the missiles and the nuclear, a lot of people were saying, they're building nuclear bombs because they're building missiles. Why would you need missiles if you don't aim to put nuclear bombs on it? That was a completely false argument. Because if you want to have missiles for nuclear bombs, you would not spend thousands and thousands of dollars figuring out precision and accuracy. You don't need to have anything accurate if you're putting a nuclear bomb on. Accuracy is only needed if you're not putting a nuclear bomb on. But because of this, the balance of terror essentially is changing dramatically in the region. My fear is that the Iranians will end up moving very close, if not even testing a bomb. But it will not be because they want to use an attack. It's because, frankly, we treat countries that have nuclear weapons very differently from those that don't. Look what Trump did with North Korea, and how eager he was to go and hug him, and all of those different things. And what happened to the Iranians. I'm very fearful that they have drawn the conclusion that their mistake was that they negotiated when they only had enrichment. They should have negotiated when, as Kim, they had nuclear weapons and the delivery systems. That is not incentive structure we should be imposing on anyone, certainly not a country like Go ahead, I'm listening.
Thank you. My question is, how much do we not know about conversations that are ongoing between our people in charge of negotiating? How many of those discussions are including Israel?
So, the Biden administration, I think, is tremendously happy that Netanyahu no longer is prime minister in Israel. The experience of the Obama administration has weighed heavily on the Biden administration. Early on in the negotiations in 2013 and 2014, the US side actually had almost full transparency with the Israelis. When Wendy Sherman was going to the negotiations in Europe, afterwards she flew to Tel Aviv, or to Ben Gurion, and then to DC, briefing the Israelis on it. Some of the concepts used in the negotiations, such as the breakout point, which is the point in which the Iranians have enough material to build a bomb, so it's just a matter of a political decision. These are all Israeli concepts that were adopted by the United States. What happened, however, was that after November 2014, when they almost got to a deal, US intelligence picked up that the Israelis were strategically leaking information from the negotiations in order to sabotage the talks. At that point, the Obama administration stopped providing those briefings. And certainly the Israeli ambassador in Washington was lobby in Congress aggressively against the nuclear deal. So at that point, there was no information sharing. The Biden administration came in with the hope that if they could just restart some of those conversations with the Netanyahu government, who was in power when Biden first came in, that they could at a minimum cause Netanyahu to not be so aggressive against the nuclear deal. They knew that he would never come in favor of it, but perhaps they could just reduce his bellicosity a little bit, and that would be helpful for Biden in Congress, etc., if Netanyahu was not adding pressure to the situation. And Bibi was quiet for a while, but it had nothing to do with this. It had to do with the internal problems in Israel and re-elections every 6 or so weeks. But the few instances in which they were talking further undermined confidence. When Blinken went to Israel, met with Netanyahu, they had an agreement that in the press conference they would not talk about the JCPOA. And what does Bibi do? Starts blasting the JCPOA and blasting Biden for even seeking to pursue it, leaving Blinken extremely frustrated and further strengthening the impression that you can't work with them. Now you have the Bennett government. And Bennett has gone out of his way to try to rebuild a bipartisan support for Israel in the United States, which traditionally, of course, has been bipartisan, but over the last 15 years, Israel has increasingly on Capitol Hill become an Republican issue. We try to work away from that and make friends with Democrats on the Hill, make friends with the White House. To a certain extent, that has been successful. They made it very clear they're not going to be publicly criticizing the Biden administration, not just on the Iran file, but it seems like the Bennett government is avoiding criticizing Biden on almost anything. Many European countries have been blasting Biden for the Afghanistan decision, not a peep out of Israel. Many countries in Asia have been very worried that what Biden did in Afghanistan means that the US is not going to defend Taiwan and that this is going to cause Japan and others to look for other options. Not a peep out of Israel on this issue. So on that, what I would still say a bit of a superficial level, it seems to be working, and there's definitely more intelligence sharing than there was before. Whether that actually will make a difference, I am very skeptical of. I don't find it particularly likely that the Israelis will be supportive or at the last minute not do something to sabotage the deal, even though they may not go at it as aggressively as Netanyahu did. I would be more than happy to be surprised, positively surprised, but I am very skeptical. The Israeli rhetoric on this at the end of the day is still saying that they introduced a new strategy to the Biden administration that they called a death by 1,000 cuts. But the end of that process is still death. This is not a process towards reviving the JCPOA. This is still a process towards killing it. So I'm skeptical, but at a minimum, I think the administration is very happy that they don't have to deal with the type of very aggressive efforts by Netanyahu to constantly create problems for them.
Trita, almost 20 years ago, we toppled the Taliban regime in Kabul, and within a year or so, toppled the Saddam Hussein regime in Iraq. And in the process, essentially eliminated for Iran two mortal or almost mortal enemies that Tehran had. Now we have a more sympathetic regime in Baghdad, but we have the return of the Taliban in Kabul. And you mentioned earlier about an ISIS attack, so this is largely a Sunni Shia issue, but it is about competing views of extremism. Could you talk about Iran's geopolitical situation as it looks to a Taliban regime to its east?
It's a great question. It's interesting because the Iranians have, of course, been complaining and they want the US out of the Middle East. And now when the United States is out of Afghanistan, they're looking at it and they go like, oh shit. What do we do now? Yeah, they're actually in a very bad situation. Very, very bad situation. Because some of them are trying to say, well, this is a slightly different Taliban, a little bit more sophisticated. The Iranians have had their own talks with the Taliban. But they're seeing what the Taliban is doing, and there's no signs that there actually will be a particularly different Taliban. They just announced a government. The government is not a shared government, it's all Taliban. They're bombing Panjshir Valley, and the Pakistanis were actively involved in that as well, providing drones and other things. So it's an elimination, and I think he also says something about our 20-year occupation. The Taliban had fought for years and years and years, and they never managed to control more than roughly 90% of Afghanistan back in the 1990s. Panjshir Valley never fell. Mazar-e-Sharif did fall, but large parts of Afghanistan were still under control of the Northern Alliance. But now, this time around, they took it in just a matter of weeks. And part of it is because how we built the Afghan army. We did not build an army that was supposed to stand on its own legs and defend the country from threats. We built it in order for it to be a dependent entity that would help us in fighting terrorism, and that's it. So when we pulled out, and we pulled out 20,000 contractors who were serving the Apache helicopters, the Afghan government had no idea how to use them, because we never taught them. So the government, in some ways, was actually stronger before all of this. We saw how quickly they fell. So from the Iranian perspective now, they're stuck with the Taliban. They don't know exactly how to handle it. They have tried to be pragmatic. They had the Taliban visit Tehran. They tried to see if they could mediate and make sure that they're on talking terms with them, of course, which is important. It's a neighboring country. They cannot afford not to talk to them. But domestically, it's extremely unpopular. The Taliban is absolutely hated. The Iranians still host roughly 3 million Afghan refugees. Most of them are Hazara Shias. They're the ones who've been the most brutalized by the Taliban. They're extremely anti-Taliban. But there's really not a lot of options they could do. I remember when this all was happening, there were journalists on the ground that were just devastated to see how fast Afghanistan fell. And we're wondering, well, why can't Iran do something? What can Iran do? After all of these sanctions, it's that Iran doesn't have that capacity. And the Afghan government had itself decided to really bank on a relationship with the United States. So the Iranians didn't have the same type of inroads in Afghanistan as they did back in the 1990s, when they were the ones who were the main backers of the Northern Alliance. So this is a very tricky situation. Then on top of that, who is now responsible for the security of Kabul airport? Turkey. Not even a neighboring state has ended up becoming responsible for that. So the Turks have a presence in Afghanistan now. Who's the country that is the effective mediator? Who does the US turn to when they need to talk to the Taliban? Qatar. Qatar is one of the big winners of this. Played a crucial role for the United States because the United States needed some way of talking to them. And again, it's called the Doha Agreement because that's where it was negotiated. 2015, the United States approves of letting Qatar end up becoming a facilitator, a mediator, but it was of course not intended to ensure that Qatar would become an ally of the Taliban. I'm not saying that it is, but it's not terribly far away from it either. So the geopolitics of this is all changing in ways that are very problematic for the Iranians, and it's not entirely clear how they're going to play it. Here's the other question, though, I think we also have to keep in mind. To what extent does this make a difference to the United States? And I'm not trying to be cruel and insensitive, but to what extent does it make a difference to the United States? Obviously, it's terrible that the Taliban are back in power. What they're doing to at least half the population that are women is absolutely terrible. But we should also keep some things in mind. The image is that there was so much progress in Afghanistan was largely in Kabul. And in Kabul, there was a lot of progress. Kabul, major city, of course, but most of the population don't live there. In fact, 70+% of the women in Afghanistan did not live in Kabul. They lived in the countryside. And for the last 20 years, they've been experiencing civil war, not progress in women's issues. They were never the benefactors of this. For them, this is probably an end of a war in which one bad entity has defeated another bad entity. None of them have been good to them. But going back, to what extent does this make a difference for the United States? I think this is a crucial issue because 20 years ago, we would have said, oh, no. We have to be there. If we're not there, they're going to give, they're going to allow terrorists to function from over there. They're going to do an attack, and we have to fight them over there in order not to fight them over here. Well, 20 years of that, $8.4 trillion later, it is very clear you don't need to control territory in order to be able to plan and execute terrorist attacks against the United States. In fact, 9/11 was not planned in Afghanistan. 9/11 was planned in apartments in Germany, because that's where they were sitting. Moreover, when it comes to collecting intelligence on what ISIS or others might be doing over there, yes, there's going to be a bit of a loss of intelligence when it comes to that. It's absolutely true. But let's also not forget, the reason why the Taliban managed to make such a return was because as we were fighting a civil war over there, we also killed, unfortunately, a very large number of civilians who were innocent. Most of the Taliban today joined the Taliban seeking revenge for what they believed was an unfair attack by the United States. So while we are there, we're actually unfortunately creating terrorists because of our activities. We're not making ourselves safe for that. The 20 years that we have successfully managed to make sure that we do not have any foreign terrorist attack on American soil is overwhelmingly because of human intelligence and much more effective bordering, rather than thinking that because we're flying drones in Afghanistan and Yemen, that's what's stopping them from coming here. The one example we have of a foreign terrorist managing to come into the United States and conduct a terrorist attack was done in Pensacola, and incidentally, it was a Saudi soldier who managed to come in because he was a Saudi soldier, which tells us something of how we may have to actually rethink some of our alliances.
Thanks for taking the time and sharing your insight. And I have a question which is stunningly simplistic. And I kind of know what your answer is, but I'm kind of like to map the limits. Suppose that the U.S. were to drop all sanctions against Iran and encourage our allies to do the same. None. No more sanctions at all, no conditions. What do you think would happen?
I don't think there's any circumstance in which the United States would lift sanctions without conditions. We have a tremendous amount of sanctions. None of them have been lifted without conditions.
Without what?
Without conditions. So were they to be lifted, they would come with conditions. The conditions for lifting the sanctions on the JCPOA was shipping out 98% of their low enrichment stockpile, imposing all of those cameras into their nuclear program. So if we were to lift more sanctions, and I'm actually a proponent of doing so, I believe that part of the reason why the JCPOA didn't have sufficient amount of anchoring within the US political system is because we never lifted primary sanctions, we only lifted secondary sanctions. The difference between those are this. Secondary sanctions are sanctions that we impose on other countries if they trade with Iran. So we sanction Spain if they're buying carpets from Iran. Primary sanctions is the sanctions that you all would be subjected to if you started buying pistachios from Iran. That's targeting Americans trading with Iran. That's what we have on Cuba, for instance. Primary sanctions were never touched in the JCPOA, only secondary sanctions. The end result of that is that when the secondary sanctions were lifted and Iran was opened up for business again, who was it open to? Everyone but Americans. So Chinese, Russians, Europeans all rushed back into the Iranian market. Almost no Americans. There were some small loopholes of subsidiaries, etc., but nothing that amounted to anything in particular. I ran the numbers on this. If the United States actually were to lift primary sanctions, and of course there would have to be a lot of things the Iranians would have to give in order for us to do so. But there's a reason why this would be good, because it really actually would benefit the United States. Based on Iran's size and population and size of its economy, which is roughly equivalent to Turkey, Iran's imports from the United States would roughly be $20 to $21 billion a year. Most of that would be partly high-tech stuff And the rest of it would be wheat, soy, corn, a lot of agricultural imports that the Iranians make. Now, the reason why I think that is quite fascinating is, if you take a look at corn, for instance, corn is grown in almost exclusively red states or red districts. Illinois is the biggest corn producer. It's a blue state, but all of the districts that are producing corn in Illinois are Republican. So it would actually primarily benefit Republican districts and their economies that saw no benefit whatsoever to this. In fact, this is what Trump himself said during the campaign 2016 when he was complaining about the JCPOA. He had no idea about geopolitics. He didn't care about that. He was saying this is unfair because now the Europeans are going to go in and do business and we Americans cannot. That was his original opposition to the deal. And if he had managed to get a new deal, which he didn't because he pursued the sanctions path, instead of going for more sincere diplomacy, I'm confident he would have put the primary sanctions on the table right away because he wants to build Trump towers in Iran. And many others would want to do business as well. So I hope that if the JCPOA is revived, that if there is some form of renegotiation down the road, if we want more from the Iranians, and there are plenty of more things we can ask for, we should put the primary sanctions on the table. Because that is actually the best guarantee that the United States will not leave the agreement. If we actually end up having a situation in which US businesses are actually engaged in the Iranian economy, and this is benefiting the American economy, then the political calculus of withdrawing from the agreement fundamentally changes. There was no cost for Trump doing this at the end of the day because there were no American businesses that would fare badly if he did.
I'll try and wrinkle on one or two of these questions, including Sky's and Jack Rush's. Sky's quite a very good question. The fact that we're out of Afghanistan, will that make any difference in terms of the motivation of the Iranians to go back to the JCPOA and say, okay, we're already talking to you, we're now even more interested in talking to you because we don't know what to do about Afghanistan with the Taliban in power. And the second question relates to the JCPOA negotiations and the sanctions. What can we think of that's new if we give up the sanctions with conditions as part of the negotiations under JCPOA? What can we bring that would be new? And you mentioned corn being shipped over there or other products. Is there some kind of foreign aid from us or the EU that would help move the negotiations along so that something happens in 6 months or a year instead of just talking, nothing happens in the JCPOA? And lastly, is the fear of having nuclear weapons in the hands of Iran frightful enough or concerning enough that we might even be able to find some receptivity with the Russians or the Chinese in some way to say, hey, we need to figure out how to do this so that Iran doesn't develop a bomb. Thank you.
3 great questions. Can you remind me what the first question was?
Yeah. It was the nuance. Does it make any difference in Iran having the on there?
Oh, yeah, okay.
In terms of how they might view working with the Americans?
I think it's a really fascinating question. And I think you can make an argument that perhaps it would. Because you see, with the US not being in Afghanistan, it's not just that the Taliban took over. It also means that Iran's deterrence against the United States actually weakened. And the reason for that is most of the American soldiers in Afghanistan were sitting ducks. If the US were to do anything against Iran, the Iranians would be retaliating against American soldiers in Afghanistan or in Iraq. Half of them are gone now. So the Iranian ability to be able to use that as a deterrence has now been significantly weakened. Will that translate into an impact on the JCPOA? It's an interesting question. I don't have an answer for it. It can make the Iranians more paranoid and actually go in the opposite direction as well. I mean, right now, this is what's so fascinating about international relations. Everyone thinks the universe circles around them. The Iranians think the US pulled out of Afghanistan in order to add pressure onto Iran. And had really nothing to do with Iran. If there was any third country this had a big thing to do with, it was China, not Iran. Again, about the focus, shifting the focus eastwards. As to your last question, there's an element of a premise there that is not entirely correct. The Russians and the Chinese have been helpful. The Russians and the Chinese were part of the P5+1. The Russians in particular actually were very helpful towards the end of the negotiations last time around. It's thanks to them that missiles are even mentioned in the UN Security Council resolution. They're not the ones that left the agreement. We did. So they're coming to the US and saying, when are you going to get serious? It's not us going to them and say, let's all, this is a threat to you as well. They're like, yes, we know. That's why we signed the JCPOA and we stuck to it. You didn't. So we don't have the best of arguments right now on that. And right now, Rob Malley is in Moscow, and I think he's probably there because he's trying to, that's the US lead negotiator, wanting to put pressure on or getting the Russian collaboration to censor the Iranians and the board of governors at the IAEA because of what the Iranians are doing on the nuclear issue. I find it unlikely that he will succeed. He may. But we have to keep one thing in mind. Last time around, when the P5+1 was struck, it was actually fascinating because the US, Russia, China, the Europeans were all on the same page. And even when Ukraine happened, the US and Russia managed to make sure that they compartmentalized their tensions, and they were at each other over Ukraine, but continued to collaborate on the JCPOA. We are no longer in that moment. Tensions with Russia may not be so bad that they will not collaborate, but even if the US manages to get Russia's vote, I think for the first time in a very, very long time, the Chinese vote is actually in play. The Chinese may put in a veto. To sabotage this, to put pressure on Biden, mindful of what Biden is doing on China. So we don't have the international consensus that we did 5-6 years ago. That's been lost, and Biden has not managed to rebuild that.
Thank you.
Have we made an assessment of what Iran's goal is with respect to nuclear weapons? Like the North Koreans, are they hell-bent to have their own nuclear weapon? And all this other stuff is just kabuki theater. They're going to have it.
Thank you. We do know, or we have our own assessment, and they're not hell-bent on getting a nuclear weapon. In fact, the rest of it is kabuki, but it's because they're not hell-bent on a nuclear weapon. Let me explain that. The intelligence of the US, the Israelis, the Europeans, all are on the same page on this. The Iranians have been looking for a nuclear weapons option, not for a nuclear weapon. There's a massive difference between the two. Nuclear weapons options means that you have everything you need to build a nuclear weapon. But you're not going to make a decision to build a nuclear weapon easily, because that is a massive decision that has a huge amount of strategic unknowns and an even larger amount of strategic negatives. You only build it if circumstances really force you in that direction. But you want to have the option. So countries like Japan has the option. They're not hell-bent on building it, but if the United States no longer provides protection to Japan, rest assured, mindful of their tensions with China, they're going to go build it. Or mindful of their tensions with North Korea, they're going to go build it. Having the option and building are two very different things. The Shah of Iran back in the 1970s, with the help of the United States, was building the option. But he recognized that it would be very stupid of him if he actually built it. Because if you take a look at the map, Iran is a giant in the Middle East. It has a conventional superiority and now also has an asymmetric superiority. If it were to make the decision to go beyond the option, actualizing the option, and build a weapon, then it will likely trigger other countries to go in the same direction. And then you could have a scenario, and perhaps an extreme scenario, in which a very tiny country like Bahrain, I guess a 50th of the size of Iran, would choose to also go and build it or buy it. Suddenly, Iran and Bahrain would be at parity. Both could destroy the other. And Iran's conventional superiority would be completely lost. This is what an Israeli general told me. He said India's big mistake was to test the bomb. because the minute they tested the bomb, Pakistan and India were equals, whereas before, India was 10 times the size of Pakistan. There's a reason why two countries, Iran and Egypt, the two largest and most populous states in the Middle East, introduced in 1973 the concept and the movement for a nuclear-free Middle East. They're the countries that lose the most if the region nuclearizes. There's a reason why a small country like Israel has nuclear weapons. It doesn't have the strategic depth or the other conventional benefits that would force it to or push it to choose to go a different direction. The only reason why the Shah wanted it was because the United States had made it clear to Iran that if the Russians were to invade, and the Shah's relations with the Russians was horrific, the United States would not come to its aid because Iran was not part of NATO or any other pact. And the Shah decided he needed to have the option if the situation got so bad that he needed to actualize it. But he was wise enough never to build one because it didn't make any sense. The current Iranian government has pursued the exact same path. They've drizzled some Islamic words on their program, but it's the same exact plan as was before. And we know that. What the JCPOA did is that it didn't prevent Iranians from building a bomb. It prevented the Iranians from having the option of building a bomb. When you don't allow a country to have even more than 300 kilos of LEU, you have deprived them of the option of building it. That's why it was stunningly that it succeeded. It was so successful. If the Iranians were hell-bent on building a bomb, they would never have signed that agreement. In fact, the Pakistanis went from 0 to a nuclear weapon in 9.5 years. The Iranians have had a nuclear program since 1968. Why don't they have a bomb if they're hell-bent on getting a nuclear weapon? If they were really hell-bent on getting a nuclear weapon, they would have had one by now, and they would never have signed the JCPOA. But the JCPOA was not there to prevent the bomb, it was preventing them from having the option. Because preventing them from having the option was what would arguably would have made sure that the Israelis felt safer and the US would not need to go into another. So you're right, the rest of this is, I don't know what the word was you used, but it was a good word. Kayuki, kabuki. But the rest of it is a lot of fluff when you scratch the surface.
My question revolves around Turkey. I'm a Turkophile, so bear with me. We mentioned Turkey a couple times, and having lived there for a couple of years and I've observed and studied them for a while, we've seen them been involved in Egypt, some wrangling around with Israel, Russia, Syria, northern Iraq, now Afghanistan. My question is, what do you think, Libya, what do you think is Turkey's long view of the world in the Middle East and their role in all of it?
It's a great question. I cannot do it justice. I think you probably would be able to offer a better answer. Certainly there's some who view Erdogan's ambitions of being neo-Ottoman, trying to recreate the Ottoman Empire. Certainly the degree of involvement of Turkey, as you mentioned, throughout the region is astonishing compared to how little it was militarily involved elsewhere. So it is one of those big question marks, and it is something that is injecting a tremendous amount of uncertainty into the calculations of all other states. Because Turkey has not found its role yet. You know, Turkey has invested decades trying to become a European power. Didn't work out, not only gave it up, but then embraced the idea that Turkey's natural role would be to be a leading Middle Eastern power, and certainly have acted like that. But I love the question though. Because it allows me to talk about a report we just published a couple weeks ago that very much touches on Turkey. You mentioned that they're involved in so many other places. Your language that you use is a very typical one in the United States. It's rather neutral. They're in Libya, they're elsewhere. It wasn't any particular judgment in it. If it had been Iran, we would have called it malign activities, for instance. There's an immediate judgment about it. And there has been a tendency in Washington for more than 4 decades now that we believe or we portray the region's ills as being caused by one single actor. And that actor is a malign actor that is really the cause as to why we have so much instability. That actor at times was Saddam Hussein, then it was Gaddafi, then it was Assad for a period. For the last 15 years or more so, it's primarily been Iran. We decided to test that proposition, that hypothesis, and see if there's really much truth in it. We scored every military intervention conducted by a Middle Eastern power in the Middle East for the last 10 years. We used a scoring system that had been developed by the University of Uppsala. We amended it slightly. We looked at every single one. We scored it. And if that proposition was true, Iran would have been an outlier. Its level of interference in other countries would have been just head and shoulders above everyone else. Instead, we see a very dramatically different picture. Without a doubt, Iran is absolutely one of the most interventionist states in the region. And it has had a steady level, I'm sorry, I don't know what I'm doing, a steady level of interventions for the last 10 or so years. The big thing, though, is that it is not an outlier. There's a cluster of 6 states that have roughly been equally interventionist for the last 10 years. Qatar, Israel, Saudi Arabia, UAE, Iran, and Turkey. For the last couple of years, the Turks and the Emiratis are more interventionist, involved in more foreign soil militarily than Iran is. Turkey and the Emiratis are above Iran right now. The lower tier of that cluster is Israel, Saudi Arabia, and Qatar. And in the case of Saudi and Qatar, at least, it's because they're paying for the interventions, but others are doing it for them. So they're more involved financially, but not necessarily militarily. The Israelis, of course, because of continued occupation, bombing of Syria, and many other places. What is also stunning about this picture is that 5 out of the 6 most interventionist powers in the Middle East that are the cause of most of the instability are armed and funded and politically protected by the United States. And they're not fighting Iran. Most of the time they're fighting each other. In Libya, the Turks and the Emiratis are going at it. And elsewhere in Yemen. So it's not that type of a clean picture in which everyone is fighting the Iranians. They're fighting each other. Now, here's the good part of this. If they're armed and politically protected by the United States, that means we have leverage. And if we're serious about stabilizing the Middle East, we have far more ability to put pressure on them to stop fighting each other and destroying Syria or Libya in the process than we do with the Iranians. That's not to say we shouldn't put pressure on the Iranians to stop it. We certainly should. But we have been focusing exclusively on one country at the expense of everyone else that has been doing it. And that's part of the reason why the region has not been stabilizing. Because we're obsessing with one state and turning a blind eye to the others. And many of those others are doing more, actually, than the Iranians. And Turkey, right now, is one of them. And Turkey's scores will go up even further now, because now they're militarily involved in Kabul.
We have time for one more question.
Self-appointed spokesman for everybody. I was confused and depressed before you started talking. Now I'm
Confused but not impressed.
uplifted, optimistic about the future, and convinced that the solution is to sell everybody 10 nuclear weapons for not much money.
I guess my job is done.
And just our job is done.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all so much.